Good morning, everyone. A warm welcome to this webinar, Madam Principal, uh, Professor Nirmal Jindal, Teacher in Charge, Dr. Rajiv Singh, Department of Environmental Studies, Convener, Prakriti Society, Dr. Anupam Sani, all the faculty members, and a distinguished speaker today, Ms. Neha Sinha, ma'am. Welcome, ma'am. There is something infinitely healing in the repeated refrains of nature, the assurance that dawn comes after night and spring after winter. These words by Rachel Carson highlights the essence of importance of biodiversity and nature. To reflect more upon this, we have a very distinguished speaker with us today. Global biodiversity is in a catastrophic decline. To understand the gravity of the issue, we will talk about conservation of biodiversity today. But to roll the event first, I would like to welcome our principal, Madam. Please share some gracious words with us and our speaker today. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Good morning, our esteemed speaker, Neha, our TIC, Dr. Rajiv Singh, and the convener of Prakriti Society, Dr. Anupam Sani, all the research scholars and dear students. I welcome you all to this webinar on wildlife and willful challenges of modern Indian conservation, organized by the Department of Environmental Sciences. And this morning we have a very distinguished guest speaker, Ms. Neha Sinha, who is a conservation biologist and policymaker. And I have seen some of her videos. She's an activist also. And I'm very happy that she is spreading this awareness about the conservation of wildlife, conservation of environment among youngsters, because the future of human species depends on this future of environment. So at present, she's working with the Bombay National History Society, and she is also an alumnus of a very prestigious, world-renowned university, Oxford University. She has an exceptional research experience and very rich, I think, knowledge in the field of conservation of wildlife. And I think it is a very, very critical issue. Being a political scientist, we often talk about climate change, global warming, carbon emission, and stuff like that. But I think that deforestation, which is clearly linked with the developmental and modernization program, and particularly in India, after 1990s, the way we are seeing that the modernization, on the name of modernization, how we are harming or destroying our nature, which is basically habitat of these wildlife as well. So in this context, we have to understand how wildlife is important, how environment is important, which is linked to human survival. So I think this talk of Neha Sinha will be very, very interesting and important to understand sustainability of environment, because we cannot go back to the state of nature. Of course, we have to develop, but at the same time, we have to sustain nature, we have to sustain wildlife, we have to sustain environment, we have to save our mountains, deserts, our oceans, our forests, everything, because forests and oceans are factors of oxygen. So we have to save all these natural resources, because human survival is impossible without the purity and without the sustainability of these resources. So I look forward to hear you, Neha. All our students are looking forward to your talk. I think they will have very interesting takeaways, and it will be alarming, as well as they will have awareness about the conservation of wildlife. So thank you very much for being with us this morning on Satyavati College platform. We are very, very honored to have you with us. Thank you very much, and I welcome all the participants once again, and I congratulate the Department of Environmental Sciences the Prakriti Society for taking these kind of initiatives, because last time also the program related to environment mitigation of carbon was very, very interesting. So I wish you all the best for organizing these kind of events, and look forward to have many more events of this kind in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was very well put about the conservation issues. Now, I would like to call Dr. Anupam Sani to introduce the participants to our speaker of the day, Ms. Neha Sinha. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Harshita. Thank you, Principal Ma'am, for your kind words and, of course, sharing your thoughts. And good morning, all of you in this webinar. So, before I begin, I would want to quote a quotation of Joy Anderson. He said that wildlife is something which cannot be constructed, and once it is gone forever. So, to learn more about wildlife conservation, I'm really delighted to introduce all of you that we have among us Dr. Ms. Neha Sinha, who's speaker, and our speaker is an award-winning wildlife conservationist. It's very nice to share because she is also associated with my alma mater, that is Department of Environmental Studies, University of Delhi as well. She has studies her MS in biodiversity conservation at Oxford University. She works with BNHS, Bombay Natural History Society, as policy and advocacy expert. She is also a noted columnist and an author. She has taught environmental politics at Delhi University. And of course, introduction cannot justify the dynamism which, of course, Ms. Neha have. And her zeal for conservation is can be seen over the YouTube videos, which we can just type and search, and I will find ample amount of work she has done. So let us give a huge round of applause. And over to you, Ms. Sinha. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. Thank you to all the students. And before I went to Oxford, I was part of Delhi University. So Delhi University is my home ground. I did my undergraduate here in DU. So I'm very happy to be here. We often talk about nature in terms of sustainability, but we also need to talk about nature in terms of the ecosystem services nature gives us. And we are actually nothing without nature, because the food that we eat, of course, comes from soil. The air that we breathe is part of a global water cycle, a global cycle of trans-evaporation that trees are part of, the oceans are part of, and the forests are part of. So actually, if we don't have nature, we can spend billions of dollars in trying to restore, and we'll never get it back. So I do agree with the quote that sometimes when you lose something, it's gone forever. And so today we're going to talk about the modern challenges to conservation. Wild and Willful is the name of my book, but the reason I put Wild and Willful here is because sometimes we're not able to understand nature and wildlife, and we think it's very wild, and we think it's outside of our control, and we tend to de-recognize nature and wildlife because it's outside our control. But I'm going to argue today that we can't actually control everything. And with climate change coming in, it becomes harder to predict what is happening. Therefore, it becomes even more important to make nature conservation a part of our planning processes and a part of our lives. So in this photograph over here, what we actually see is a modern wetland in India. And I'm going to start with wetlands today, and then I'm going to move to trees and forests, and finally to the policy landscape that we have in India for wildlife conservation. But I wanted to start with this picture because we often think that nature is something that's out there, that's very far away from us. So it's in Corbett Tiger Reserve, in the mountains of the Himalayas, it's in a rainforest in Kerala, or it's on the islands of the Andaman or the coral reefs of Lakshadweep. But actually nature is very much right next to us, and we are actually part of ecosystems. So if there's a forest fire, cities get affected. If there is a wind coming in from the Arabian Sea or the Bay of Bengal, we are going to have rainfall. If it snows in Shimla, then Delhi is going to shiver. So, we are not apart from the seasons, we are not apart from nature. And cities also, we are all in Delhi right now, cities also have natural drainage patterns and natural topographies which need to be recognized. So for example, the city of Delhi has the Yamuna River and the ridge forest, the Aravallis, which are both important features of Delhi, because if you try to make anything over a wetland, you're actually going to get flooded, because a wetland is part of a natural drainage process. This is a wetland in Basai, which is in Gurgaon, and it's actually a very large wetland. And so you see in the front, you have the water. Towards the back, I don't know if you recognize, this is water hyacinth, which is actually an invasive weed. It is covering the water. Behind that, you have the high rises coming up. And the closer the buildings come to the wetland, the more they are going to get flooded in the monsoon. And this is something, that urban planning needs to understand. But the reason I'm showing you this is because I want to start by saying that a single ecosystem holds many different kinds of components. And I remember teaching Chandranshu this when I was teaching him in DES, that an ecosystem and biodiversity is the actual components, but it's also the interrelationships between those components. So if you have a wetland, then you have, for example, trees growing next to the wetland, which is the first photograph. If you look below it, there's a bird standing on this, muddy bank in the water. This is actually a bird that lives near water. In the last photograph, you have the bird. It's actually standing in the water. So that's a marshy part of the wetland. So a single wetland will have many components, and a single wetland will have many kinds of biodiversity, not all of which is in the water, but it's also around the water. So these are interrelationships that we need to factor in when we're trying to understand a site and when we're trying to plan for it. So the first bird you see on top, it's the citrine wagtail. It's actually a migratory bird. So it's only here in winter. I'll tell you a bit more about migration. Below it, on the left, that's a bee eater. It eats bees and insects. It's also migratory. In the middle, you have a heron, which hunts in the water for fish. So it's a fish-eating bird. And the final slide, the big purple bird is usually eating vegetation, and it lives in the water. So what I'm trying to say is, in just this slide, you see birds occupying different niches or different parts of that wetland ecosystem. So if we had to talk about the wetland, we need to talk about the banks on the wetland, the water in the wetland, the vegetation in the wetland, as well as the surrounding area of the wetland. So if you have this, if you have all these buildings eating away the banks of the wetland, you're compromising the integrity of this wetland and the ecosystem services that it can give you. So what are the ecosystem a wetland would give? Very briefly, it saves us from flooding oftentimes. So if you're building over this, you're going to be flooded. It also sequesters carbon. It obviously is a habitat for wildlife and biodiversity. And if managed well, a wetland can also be a site for recreation and tourism. So for example, some of the most well-known sites in India, natural sites, are wetlands. So whether it's Chilika Lagoon in Odisha, whether it's Bharatpur Keoladeo in Rajasthan, which is actually a wetland sanctuary, these are all places where people go to see the water, to see the wildlife, and these are important tourist sites. So in the last slide, I showed you a couple of migratory birds, and I want to also start by saying that migration is a natural process that takes place every year. And birds actually follow what we call flyways in the world, which is that they actually follow fixed routes every year to survive, to live. Migration is not a choice, it is a necessity. And India is part of a very important migration flyway, which is the Central Asian flyway. So if you see right in the middle, the lime green border, that's the Central Asian flyway. So India is getting birds from north. So they're coming from Palearctic, Arctic, and Central Asia, Europe, Tibet, China, Mongolia, etc. And they come to India. Because we are the biggest landmass above the Indian Ocean, we are important for almost 90% of the birds on this flyway. And there are also swimways that animals use. So for example, migration, you have whales, you have dolphins, you have dugongs. So it's not just birds that migrate. And it's important when we talk about climate change to also understand these kind of natural processes. Our climate is also influenced by the way ocean currents move, for example. And if we have millions of species migrating every year just in order to survive, and as I said, it's not a choice for them, they have to move towards warmer areas when it's very cold, for example, and they have to go back to the cold areas when they have to breed. So now when summer sets in, all these birds or animals will go back to where they came from. And this is something that happens year after year. And we may think that it's very far away from us, but it's actually very much a part of our lives. And we need to kind of, when we're talking about sustainability and ecosystem services, we also need to consider how wildlife uses the planet, how wildlife uses waters and skies and islands and wetlands and forests, etc. This is a map of the bar-headed goose. So the bird is on the left. So if you see the dots, it comes from Central Asia, where the map is moving right now, and it comes to India every winter. It's in Delhi right now, and it's the highest flying bird. It can fly over Mount Everest. So these birds have to usually fly over the Himalayas to come. This species does fly over the Himalayas to come to India, and then it will go back when it gets warm so that it can go and breed in its cold areas. So at the bottom, you're seeing the annual chart. It's moving. So wherever that needle is, that is showing you where the bird is. So basically the bird, if we don't have India on this map, we take away India, where will the bird go? It'll have to go to Australia or Indonesia. Australia is really far. Indonesia, Southeast Asia, much smaller countries than India. So that makes India extremely important, and not just for birds, also for dolphins, also for whales, also for sea turtles. You might have heard of the olive ridley turtles in Odisha. They all come to India to lay their eggs. They come from very far away from other countries. They are also international visitors. So this is a picture of Najafgarh in Delhi, which is a site I work on. And right in the first line at the bottom, those are the bar-headed geese. In the middle, you have greater flamingos that live there. And I cannot emphasize enough how so many of our local sites are actually internationally relevant because they're used by international wildlife. And it's not just about wildlife, it is also what that site does for us. If these sites can be well managed, they're extremely important areas for carbon sequestration. They're extremely important for our recreation, and they're extremely important for the ecosystem services they give us. So if you can imagine this city without its wetlands, without its parks, without its forests, city forests, without, open areas, I think we'd all die of depression. And during the pandemic, when people could not go out, they realized more and more how important we need open spaces for our own mental health. Apart from obviously the fresh air it gives us, the microclimate regulation. So if you go near a wetland or a forest, there's a lot of microclimate regulation that is happening over there. So it usually tends to be much cooler near a forest by 4 or 5 degrees. Another very interesting bird, this is the common crane. So on the right, on top, you have the common crane, and it's actually coming from so far away. It's coming from Europe. It's coming from Europe, and it's coming from Asia, and it's coming in winter to spend time. It doesn't go too deep south. It's usually, in north and kind of the Deccan and the center of India. Smaller than the Sarus crane, but a very beautiful bird. It's not a very good picture. It was a very foggy day, but here is the common crane in Delhi, again near Najafgarh where I work. It's a small flock. It's smaller than Sarus. It's a very shy bird. You can't go very close. But I'm just emphasizing that this bird has come from really far away, and it's using even a city like Delhi for its survival. And as I told you in the beginning, that even a wetland is not used just by wetland birds. It's used by a variety of biodiversity, and one such biodiversity is the bio-weaver. This is an iconic bird, and the reason I'm showing you this picture is because most Indians would recognize this bird, especially if you go to rural India. A date palm tree or a tree with thorns, on the right is a babool tree, or on the left is a date palm. These are both trees with thorns. It prefers to make this beautiful nest on thorny trees next to wetlands. So it needs water and it needs grasses in order to live, because it's making its nest using grasses, and usually it will make these nests on a thorny tree to save itself from predators. So if you lose, for example, grasses, you lose wetlands, you lose these thorny native trees of India, then you lose this bird. And in fact, the weaver bird is not doing well. Buyer beaver is still okay, but there are many other kinds of weaver birds, and they're really almost extinct today because we are losing this diversity. And again, before I get into the policy and the legal details, if we learn to just understand the way that biodiversity plays an important function. So in this very frame, you're seeing that thorny native tree is important. The wetland is important because it makes its nest next to a wetland, and the grass is important. Without these things, the bird is going to decline. The way the house sparrow declined, because it didn't have enough insects to feed its chicks, it didn't have enough places or hedges to roost in. Similarly, native biodiversity is completely irreplaceable, both for ecosystem services for us, because foreign species cannot give us the ecosystem services we need. They usually need more water or more resources in order to survive because they're not Indian, but they also are supremely important for our native species. And without a single component, you can actually have a collapse of that species or that ecosystem. So I just going to the topic of this today's seminar. This is a map of Najafgarh Jheel. And if you look at this map, so I'm on the expert committee by the Delhi government, and we are looking at making an environmental management plan. We've just finished the EMP for the site, and this is the map that we've made. So what I want you to see over here, I just told you about wetlands and how complex they are. But if you look at this map, the wetland is right in the middle. It's actually a jheel, almost like an oxbow lake, but not really, but it's a jheel. And actually that blue line is a river. So Najafgarh Jheel is formed by Sahibi River. And most Delhiites don't know about Sahibi. They only think that Yamuna is the only river in Delhi, but actually Sahibi is an Aravali river, and it's unfortunately known as Najafgarh Nala because that's the political reality of this river, that it has a lot of garbage, it has a lot of industrial effluent. So this is a jheel that was at least 200 square kilometers big till a few years ago. By a few years, I would say around 200 years ago, it was about 200 square kilometers. When we look at the old maps, today it's 9 square kilometers because the city is eating into it. And the other thing I want to show you is this is a real-time example of how difficult it becomes to conserve nature or biodiversity, because there is also a state boundary. So if you see the second line below the river, below the blue line, there's another line. That is actually the state boundary between Delhi and Haryana. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the wetland is in both Delhi and Haryana. In fact, most of the water is in Haryana. So Delhi has made the EMP. Delhi is trying to work with Haryana, but these two states do not get along, especially when it comes to water. And since most of the water is in Haryana, whatever Haryana does is going to have a very big bearing on just the future of this wetland. And states fighting about water is a very pressing issue. It's always been an issue. You have tribunals just to adjudicate between river disputes, for example. This is also a river. But how we get political consensus is one thing. The other thing is that nature does not follow political boundaries. And therefore, when we are planning for wildlife and nature, it is important for us to look at the landscape and not just the boundaries. So it could be a forest, it could be the Himalayas, the mountain range, it could be the Aravallis, which comes from Rajasthan to Delhi. It's even there in parts of Gujarat. So what I'm suggesting is, when we're talking about nature, we have to understand its components, but we also have to understand that we have to look at the landscape, the ecological landscape, and not just the political boundaries, right? So to manage a topographical or an ecological entity and to maintain the ecological character, we may have to have this complex multi-level framework in which you have an interstate or maybe sometimes even international boundaries, as units of planning and cooperation. So these are some of the, just giving you an example of, some of the things that we have to do in order to conserve sites. So these are some of the recommendations we had to preserve this wetland. So we are saying, do not make industry here. And there are many wetlands with industries. There are wetlands which have factories in the wetland, next to the wetland, on the island in the wetland. So it happens more often than you would think. We are saying don't have hazardous substances. You cannot use this as a manufacturing unit. We are saying cannot, dump all your garbage. And you'll be surprised how many wetlands are actually municipal dumps in India. So Deepor Beel in Assam is the municipal dump for Guwahati. Palikarnia in Chennai is the dump for Chennai, etc., etc. And of course, there's, the effluents, the untreated waste, whether it's sewage or whether it's industrial waste. And we're also saying you don't do any permanent construction on the wetland, because if you make permanent constructions, you are really interfering with groundwater. You're really interfering with recharge, you're interfering with the ability of the wetland to be a wetland and to perform the ecological services it has to perform. So these are the recommendations we've given. How much of it gets done depends on political will, but we look at our role as experts who advocate and who need to make this case that if you want to have this wetland, you have to prevent all of this from happening. In cities, it's very tough, but it's becoming increasingly tough, even outside cities, to be able to achieve just these 4 or 5 things. So I spoke to you about migratory birds, a little bit of a policy framework. We are part of many international agreements. We have a lot of domestic laws for environment. They don't always get followed, but it's important for all of us to know what they are. So we're a member of the CMS, which is the Convention on Migratory Species. It's a United Nations treaty. And on the left at the bottom, you see this logo. There's a tiger, there's a woman, there's a bird, and there's some seeds in her basket. So that is the logo that India had made for the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, when we had the CBD meeting here in India. So I'm talking about both CMS, which is Convention on Migratory Species, as well as Convention on Biological Diversity. So we are both, important members of these United Nations conventions, and in the same way that we also have one for climate change, which is UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So basically, what is the purpose of being part of this? We are part of this group of nations that's trying to be a part of international cooperation. So when we talk about Convention on Migratory Species, we are talking about migration at the regional, Asian, and global level. So we have action plans, for example, for birds that migrate from Europe to India, or birds that migrate from trans-Himalayan regions outside India to India, or whales that migrate, or dolphins that migrate, etc., etc. So we have these meetings every 2 or 4 years, and we have to give a report to these organizations on what we have done to uphold these organizations, the treaties that we've signed, and we're also supposed to reflect it all in our domestic laws, that is, ratify it. So when we are not conserving migratory species, or we are actively destroying habitat, then the CMS can come to us and say, stop doing this, because you're not supposed to do this, because we have an agreement to save migratory species or save biodiversity, etc. It's a complicated process because the sovereignty of the country can never be challenged by any United Nations convention. But I'm just trying to explain to you that it is a constant negotiation. There's a lot of work that goes behind it. There's a lot of, it's also a federal thing. So the center tells the states, and the states make their action plans. We also work with states to do capacity building so they can understand the policy framework and make policies, make action plans which can make sure it gets followed. So it's a long, complex process like everything else. And the goal is to save the migratory species and the biodiversity. So, I know that's a bit heavy. That's why I have the slide over here. Just wanted to tell you that the samel is blooming. The samel is the Bombax ceiba. It is the tree on the right and the left, of course. So it's an Indian tree. And like I showed you the wetland and how it has different niches. and how different, animals occupy different niches. The semal is a very important species. It's an Indian tree that flowers at springtime. It's actually flowering. I invite you to go outside and observe a semal near you because it's a very rewarding experience. On the left is a plum-headed parakeets. I saw them about 4 or 5 days ago. And on the right, you have a semal with a peacock on it. I don't know if the peacock is gotten cut out, but basically this is a keystone species, and a keystone species is a species which has a disproportionately large impact on other wildlife. So for example, a peepal tree or a banyan tree also considered keystone species because they're a very important source of food for birds and animals, mammals, bats, and squirrels, etc. And same is true for the semal. So now is the time for you to observe this flowering tree and understand the difference that a native tree can make to the wildlife around it. I would be remiss if I didn't tell you about all the changes to our environmental laws that are now happening. So on the left is a column I wrote for Hindustan Times. The Forest Conservation Act is being changed. I can't go into it in too much detail, but the purpose of these changes is to make industry more easy to function in India. And the Forest Conservation Act now says, the proposed amendment says that, railways should have right of way in forests, and roads and highways should have right of way in forests, as opposed to animals having right of way in forests. And on the right is another piece that I wrote. The Biodiversity Act and the Wildlife Protection Act is also being changed, again with similar motives. Now, this is I'm not here to blame our current government or the last government. The point I'm trying to make over here is that environmental conservation, despite our international and domestic commitments, is still seen as a choice, is still seen as secondary to the needs of industry and the needs of development. And if you read developmental economics, you will know that development and growth are not the same thing. So you can have growth which has no social consciousness or no equity, or you can have development which thinks about social safeguards, environmental safeguards. Usually development which is more socially oriented would be slower. So you won't maybe have double-digit growth every year, but you will get there eventually. And around the world, the economies that have completely destroyed their wildlife and biodiversity are going back towards decommissioning all those activities. So for example, the US is breaking down its big dams because the rivers have completely altered after the big dams were made. China is moving almost completely to renewable energy because they've had major air, water pollution issues. And they have local extinctions of many species, including pollinators like birds and bees. It's so bad in some places in China that they actually hand pollinating flowers because the bees are dead. So this is not something, restoration after complete extinction is extremely difficult. So the ease of doing business today has taken precedence over everything else. It's a very big challenge because once the law changes, it becomes very hard to be able to press for any conservation. But at the same time, the climate is also changing. We are experiencing much more difficult and unpredictable patterns. And the Ministry of Earth Sciences has said India is going to have more rainfall in the Himalayas, which is going to be catastrophic because more rock slides, landslides, etc. And hot spells will get hotter, which is probably why we have many more forest fires now, though we've always had forest fires. But the intensity is increasing all over the world. And all these kind of shocks that we have to go through, we have to persevere, can only be made easier if you have nature-based buffers or nature-based solutions. So, for example, mangroves on the coastline help us to combat cyclones that come from the sea. And having trees on slopes prevent rock slide and landslides on slopes. And having a good drainage system, a natural drainage system, which is not building over canals and lakes, etc., will help us when there's excessive rainfall. It will save us from excessive flooding. We can never be saved completely from floods or tornadoes or drought, but it can be buffered if we work with nature-based solutions. So I wanted to end on a happy note. Just wanted to tell you this remarkable initiative by citizen scientists of Kerala. This is the Atlas of the Birds of Kerala. So what is an Atlas of Birds? It's basically telling you which bird is found where. And it's actually a very big job because it's a big state. Even in Delhi, which is only 1400 square kilometers, obviously much smaller than Kerala, if you were to ask me where is this particular bird found in Delhi, like tell me all the places a house sparrow is found or all the places where Egyptian vulture is found, it would be very difficult. It would be many years of data collection. So the remarkable thing about this publication is that it's been made by citizen scientists, that citizen bird watchers working with, other organizations have collected data over years to make this atlas. So what I'm trying to say is everything is not always up to the government. It is also up to citizens to take things, to monitor sites, to be an active part and to actively observe what's around them and try to advocate for change, to have, nature conservation around us. It's not always up to the member of parliament or the chief minister. So these are greater flamingos in the Yamuna River at this time of the year. You should go and see them in Okla Sanctuary. So Okla again is between Delhi and Uttar Pradesh. So like all good wetlands and rivers, it's very much interstate. So the challenges are very different. In Delhi, you have some protection, in UP, you don't, etc., etc. It goes on. So please go see the greater flamingos in Okla. This is a survey of our partners in Mahanadi in Odisha. They're surveying for riparian birds, meaning birds who live across the river, and including the migratory birds that come to Odisha at this time of the year. So again, citizen involvement. It's all over India. You may not know about it, but trust me, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of herpetologists and bird watchers and enthusiasts who even will study moths around them, all kinds of biodiversity, and they're collecting information and making a very important contribution to science as we know it. So what are the actions that we can all undertake? We can pick a site and monitor it, to see what wildlife is there, what is the activity, are there any threats? It's important that policy and law should only change with the inputs given by science and expertise. Science must lead when it comes to conservation. It cannot be opinions. It cannot be what I like or what you don't like, or, we need to have data, we need to have evidence, we need to have science. It's also interesting and valuable and rewarding to understand linkages between different ecosystems at a landscape level. So the river and the wetland, for example, is one linkage, in a tree and a forest. Not all trees are forests, but even trees around forests, it's basically animals use both. So you can have the ridge and you can have avenue trees, and the animals will be moving between both because they require both. Usually in order to survive. And it's also important for us to try to create knowledge products like that atlas that you saw. It could just be a bird list, it could be a pamphlet, it could be anything in our lives that we choose to. It could be a Facebook post, which is public. And I think citizen empowerment is a very important tool across the world. So Ukraine has been bombed by Russia, and Russians are standing on the streets protesting against Russia invading Ukraine. And citizens make or break any issue, or for us to think we have a lot of time would be wrong, because we don't actually have so much time. A lot of animals have already gone extinct, and a lot of them are on their way out. In my generation, we are going to see the extinction, at least of the great Indian bustard and a bunch of grassland species that are losing, their space very fast. And India is bringing the cheetah from Africa, because we don't have the cheetah anymore. But, there's no point bringing in something after it's gone. While we have something, we must preserve it. And I think also we are the generation that's going through climate change. It's undeniable today. And therefore, for us to know what's happening in the world around us is extremely important. Whatever we decide to do or not do can only start by having some knowledge and being aware of what's around us. So thanks a bunch. On the left is the Palash tree. It's also an Indian tree, Butea monosperma. It is going to flower in about a month's time. So after the Semel comes the Palash. Right in the middle of the tree, that's a sunbird nectaring, purple sunbird nectaring on the flowers. On the right is the passiflora with a gull butterfly on it. That's my Twitter handle if you want to reach me. And this is my book. If anybody wants to read, it's about 15 species of India and their conservation needs. So mammals, birds, butterflies, reptiles, etc. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was an interesting data-driven talk, which not only discussed the importance of biodiversity, but also emphasized that the conservation issue is not related to a region. It is actually cross-boundary issue. And I hope the learners have taken many takeaways from this talk. And as an avid biodiversity observer myself, I enjoyed the pictures of all the birds and trees that you presented. And now I would like to take your permission if we can take some questions from the participants.
Yes, of course.
So over to you, Manish, sir. So please unmute yourself.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Harshita. Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to thank you, ma'am, for giving such a beautiful piece of information to our learners, as well as us. And the advices what you have put through, I think the learners are going to put through in their whole life. But there are certain questions that definitely they are going to ask us in the classroom. Definitely they are not going to ask you here. So, but they are going to ask us. First, I will ask just one question that is related to the part. As you said that there is always a kind of dispute between the rivers that we all know, that is, and we are having the policy related to that. That is, we are working on the policies under the River Dispute Act 1956. So are we governing some policies that come with some integrated approach for the wetland conservation in that act?
Not at all. In fact, wetlands are not seen as part of rivers at all. And again, it's because we don't take the time to, there's no science that's driving these policies. It's usually just politics. And not only, disputes of rivers, we also have this incredible engineering plan to change the course of rivers. So I don't know if you know the Ken-Betwa issue. They want to change the course of Ken River in Madhya Pradesh to join it with Betwa River artificially for an irrigation project. And, the people who need to talk to are hydrologists and biodiversity experts, because it's a huge project. It's thousands of crores, but more than it being thousands of crores, it's going to change the entire landscape. So today in policy wetlands, we have a different act for wetlands. That's for the wetland rules of 2017, and we treat rivers differently, even though wetlands and rivers are interconnected. Not all, but wetlands are a very important source for rivers. So when rivers flood, the wetlands give nutrients to the river. So for example, fish move from wetlands to rivers. And if you have a really polluted river like Yamuna, then it comes alive in the monsoon, not just because it gets water from rainfall, but also because it floods the wetlands along the banks, and it gets new fish stock and new gastropods and cetaceans and all kinds of things. So it comes alive, and a lot of our rivers are amongst the dirtiest in the world today. And therefore, if we don't conserve those wetlands, they'll never get that new stock of biodiversity that the river needs. And only if the river is biodiverse can it actually clean itself. So a lot of the times, if you go to Agra, Yamuna is much cleaner. It's because also as the water flows, it is able to clean itself, because there's so many animals and organisms in the water that are performing some role. So they're scavengers like turtles and fish, etc. And there are also bacteria that is cleaning. So what I'm trying to say is that they cannot exist without each other, the wetland, the river. But unfortunately, we don't have this interlinkage. There's a very good Ganga notification which talks about preserving the river Ganga by preserving all the tributaries and distributaries of the river, which is a very good approach to take. Because if I only go to save the Ganga and not, for example, the Yamuna, it doesn't make any sense, because they meet and nutrient exchange is there. So that is the only one, unfortunately. We still need to, the Convention on Biological Diversity has a common plan for rivers and wetlands, for fresh water, basically. But in India, this is a policy gap for us. We don't even have an act to save our rivers. So a lot of people have been asking for river regulation zones or an act just for our rivers, for flowing water, but we don't have it. We just don't have it. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Over to you, Chandransu. Any questions?
It's really serendipitous because I've been talking about in situ conservation, ex situ conservation, and the role of human communities in conservation in the classes. Most of these kids are here who would have a surprise question test on Monday from this topic. Yes. With that said, ma'am, we have, based on your presentation, we saw that there's a lot of role or a lot of gaps which policy making and requires. We need better education, better information on the part of the policymakers. My question, and hopefully most of my students would also be curious, what is the role of general populace? How can citizen initiatives like the ones that happened in Kerala play a more crucial role in closer to home case studies like in Delhi? What can students of our college or people from Delhi can do to improve things here?
So it would start by, studying something around you. Like it could be a tree, it could be a wetland, it could be, we need to start by understanding what we need to observe, what are we observing? So for example, if I observe a tree, then I'm observing when does it flower, what are the birds or animals that use it, or maybe even what are the people that use trees, like there are people that use trees in Delhi, right? Like you'll have a barber, you'll have people resting. A lot of the working population needs trees because they walk on the road. They don't have cars. So if you don't have trees, it's unbearably hot. And studies show us that trees cool the tarmac by up to 15 degrees. So it's up to 15 degrees cooler if there's a big tree. So we need to figure out what is the point of interest. So like if it's a tree, then you have to start observing 4 or 5 things around it, and I can help you. I can tell you what to observe. And once we have that little bit of knowledge base, 6 months, 8 months of study or whatever, then we can begin to organize for whatever cause needs that help. So there's a very robust movement to save the Aravlis in Delhi and in Gurgaon, and those are normal people. They're not people like me who are conservation biologists. They are doctors and chartered accountants and students and school students even, and they're trying to do a couple of things. They're trying to get the Aravali notified as forest, for example, because it's not notified in Haryana. They're trying to get this landfill moved away from the Aravlis because the mountain of garbage is taller than the actual Aravlis, and it's leaching into the lakes of that area, Damdama, Surajkund, all these famous lakes, where maybe not your generation, not even mine, but the one before us, our parents used to go there on holiday. Like you ask anybody little older, like maybe in their 50s or 60s, what were the picnic spots in Delhi NCR, and likely they'll tell you, they'll say Qutub Minar, they'll say Damdama and Surajkund Lake, because that was a very important picnic spot. So those Damdama has really dried up, Surajkund has also really dried up, but there's a garbage mountain there which is leaching into the water. So these people are normal people who, what they're doing is, A, they observe biodiversity and they make records of what they can see so that there's some baseline. B, they interact with municipality or whatever, whatever particular thing they're trying to change, they interact with that. So for the garbage, it's the municipality, for example, it's the forest department for notifying the forest. And finally, they keep up public pressure by, doing protests or talking to the press or, just making a citizens group with their own charter of demands. And they've been doing this for maybe 5 to 7 years now, and they're not always successful, by the way. It's important for us to also recognize that sometimes we get into all of this and it's not successful, but you kind of have to keep looking at it as a kind of mission. And a lot of college and school students were involved in trying to save the trees of South Delhi, Sarojini Nagar, all those places which were being redeveloped, and it was not successful. But the point is, it created a community, and it created a community of thousands of people who actually would take out time from their lives to, go there and stand there and protest, or go and do tree walks, So, I mean, I would say we can start really small by doing a tree walk, around your colony, or telling your RWA that these are the important trees. Don't cut dead trees, because dead trees have owls in them. Animals do need dead trees, and, have native species. One of the easiest ways to advocate for better nature is to advocate for native species, which are much more important for the ecosystem. So there could be multiple ways. And let me tell you that most people in most cities who are involved are not conservationists. So in Bombay, you have the protest, or the entire movement to save RA and RA Park, and that was not conservationist. It was against students and other people who didn't want the forest to be cut down for the metro yard. For Bombay, other places in Bombay as well, you've had people trying to save the coastline. In Bangalore, people trying to save trees from new flyovers and new roads. In Pune also. So Kolkata, they're trying to save the East Kolkata wetlands from real estate. These are normal people. They're not people who've studied degrees in conservation. And it's just that they don't want, how our city is made around us is a matter of public interest. So the public that lives there, the citizens that live there, have a right to say that I don't want this waste to energy plant near me because it's polluting the air. Or, there shouldn't be a landfill in a forest, or there shouldn't be a landfill near water because it's leaching into the groundwater, right? Or, don't cut all the trees because the smog tower is not working. For a normal person, having a tree is the best chance of having a little bit of fresh air, because otherwise Delhi is the most polluted place for years, right? So we have to identify the issue. But before that, observing a natural feature around us and doing awareness like walks or talks, all of that is the base. And then we can start identifying the issues. And I assure you, everybody involved is just an ordinary citizen standing up for their cities.
Thank you, ma'am. I think that satisfies everyone else's queries too. Thank you. And you can always reach out to her. Neha ma'am is available on Instagram and Twitter. You can reach out to her there too.
Okay, I would like to call.
Can we have a group photograph that everybody can switch on their cameras and we can
Yes,
click?
sir.
Okay. Somebody might please click the picture. Yes, over to you, Harshita.
Yes, sir. So, ma'am emphasized upon the importance of the voice of democracy and citizen partnership in biodiversity conservation. And we cannot agree more to this. And to this, I call Dr. Yogita Prabhakar to present the vote of thanks. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Harshita. Good afternoon, everyone. It has been such an honor to organize and be in part of this event. And on the behalf of Department of Environmental Studies, I would like to thank and share a heartfelt gratitude to our principal, Professor Nirmal Jindal, for always supporting our such initiatives. And I would like to thank our special guest, Ms. Neha, who took time out of her busy schedule to interact with the budding minds. Ms. Neha's talk was a fresh walk towards nature. Thank you, ma'am. Sincere thanks to Dr. Rajiv Singh, teacher in charge of Department of Environmental Studies, Dr. Anupam Sani, convener of Prakriti Society, all faculty members under whose constant guidance this talk has been successfully conducted. My heartfelt gratitude to all members of Prakriti Society who ensured the success of this event. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yogita. Thank you so much, Ms. Neha ma'am, for taking out time to interact with all the students and learners. Thank you so much. With this, the information related to her Insta account and Twitter account is available. So if you want to connect with her, that's there. Thank you so much. With this, we end this event. Thank you.
Thanks a bunch. Thank you for having me.
We can end the meeting, sir.
Just give me a second. I would share the attendance form and feedback form once again for participants who joined.
Also, the participants should fill the attendance and feedback form that is there in the chat box. All right.
Please make sure all of you fill your attendance positively. Please share your feedback and opinions on the form. It helps us organize such events in future as well. So your opinion is really important. Please make sure you fill it. Thank you.
And student, please take the screenshots as well, okay? And make a report of it. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.